Good morning, everyone. So today is the week fourth of our this mini master. So let's start with our next two chapters. That will be the factors affecting feed consumption and the feed processing and preparation methods. So this week's thought points will be how that we need to attain high levels of productivity that provides the need for studying and understanding the factors that influence feed intake. Also, we will talk about the factors that affect the feed consumption by animals that are of great interest because of the economic factors related to feed intake and cost of production. So we all know that additional costs are incurred at low levels of productivity, including greater labor that are required to maintain animals over a longer period of time, longer type of invested capital, and less efficient use of facilities and equipment. So why there is a need to attain high levels of productivity provides the impetus for studying and understanding the factors that influence this feed intake. Also, why it is important to be aware of the processes to which a feed has been subjected and the effect each process has on the nutritive value and efficiency of utilization of feeds. So these are the two scenarios that we will be talking today. So why it's important to be aware of processes to which the feed has been subjected. We all know that feed, forages, grains, vitamins and mineral supplements and so on represents the major cost in animal production. In ruminants, which typically consume more forage than other domestic species, feed may represent about 50% or more of the total production costs, and in non-ruminants, the feed may cost about 80% or more of total production costs. So that's why it's very imperative to supply a nutritionally adequate diet and to prepare the diet in a manner that encourages consumption without waste and allows high efficiency of feed utilization. The feed that has to be processed may be modified during many steps involved between crop harvest and feeding. So these processes may directly affect the feeding value as well as the ease of handling and mixing of the products treated. This is so because animals that are fed for high production become more selective and because in ruminants the digestibility tends to decrease as level of feeding increases. It has been found that feed preparation is often more important for larger animal production operations with great mechanization. So let's talk about these two scenarios one by one. Animal feed consumption are of great interest because of the economic factors that are related to feed intake and cost of production. The efficiency of production can be increased in animals if their feed intake can be maintained at a high level, and this can be achieved by increasing the total efficiency of production that can be increased greatly in growing, finishing, and lactating animals if their feed intake can be maintained at a high level. The net cost is usually less for high rate of production in intensive animal production system. This is because the additional costs are incurred at low levels of productivity. That might include the greater labor that's required to maintain the animals over a longer period of time, a longer tie-up of invested capital, and some less efficient use of facilities and equipment. So the various factors that affect the feed consumption, let's start with the palatability and appetite. What does palatability mean? Palatability may be defined as the degree of acceptability of a feed or feedstuff to the taste or the degree of its acceptability to be eaten by an animal. Palatability is determined by appearance, odor, taste, texture, temperature, and other sensory properties of the feed. So it's actually the palatability is the result of summation of many different factors that are sensed by the animal that we talked about. That's the odor, the taste, texture, temperature, and other sensory properties. But these properties are in turn affected by the physical and chemical nature of the feed. Palatability is usually measured by giving animals a choice of two or more feeds so that they can express a preference. So, what do we mean by appetite? Appetite generally refers to internal factors, physiological or psychological, that stimulate or inhibit hunger in the animal. This hunger can be satisfied by calories. The appetite is satisfied by the palatability. Another factor is the taste. The basic tastes are described as sour, salty, and bitter. In addition to the so called common chemical sense, that's the detection of certain chemicals that do not fall in one of these four classes. Most taste research has been done with pure chemicals in water solutions or as constituents of dry diets. We all know that animals are able to taste the chemicals that dissolve partly because of taste buds located primarily on the tongue, but also on the palate, pharynx, and other parts of the oral cavity. Lower animals may have external taste buds on antennae, feet, and other appendages. On the tongue, different areas are sensitive to different tastes. For example, in humans, the tip and front edges of the tongue are particularly sensitive to sweet and salty flavors. On the sides, the tongue is more sensitive to sour, and at the back, it's bitter. The number of taste buds varies greatly among species. Sheep and cattle all know that they prefer grasses with high organic acid content. That's the silage. So, providing a flavor in dry feed for pigs may temporarily increase their dry feed intake. Moving to the odor, odors are produced by volatile compounds. Investigators have been unable to agree on a single broad classification of odors such as we find in the taste. So it's conceded that most animals have a keener sense of smell than humans do, but quantitative information at this time is not adequate to predict an animal's response. A lot of researches have been done regarding the odor of the feed. Arnold found that loss of the sense of smell did not increase the consumption of any of five plant species, and that intake of two was decreased. A wide variety of odoriferous compounds may be objectionable to sheep at first, but they may eat the feed later on. This information suggests that odor may serve as an attractant but may not greatly influence total subsequent consumption. One more factor that affects the feed consumption is the sight. Many, though not all, animal species have better vision than humans. However, the importance of sight as it affects food consumption in animals is not understood fully. Experimental evidence in humans indicates that sight has a pronounced effect on taste because individuals they tend to associate different colors, shapes, and other visual cues with known flavors and odors. So sight in animals appears to be used more for orientation and location of food. Cattle, it has a research has been done on cattle and sheep that shows no effect of coloring feed like red, green, or blue on the feed preference. There are certain physical factors that affect the feed consumption. The texture and particle size of feedstuffs may influence acceptability. Most domestic and some wild ruminant species will readily accept pelleted feeds and may prefer them to the same feeds presented in unpelleted form. Even though even though they may be completely unfamiliar with them. So many animals will adapt more readily to raw or cracked grains than to the whole grains. For example, total feed intake of cattle is highly dependent on the quality of roughage that's being consumed. It has been found that there are certain feed preparatory methods that reduce the dustiness usually that result in an increased feed intake as almost all animals discriminate against dust if given a chance to do so. So this is probably one reason the succulent feeds that are more readily consumed than the dry feeds. That means the feeds with more water content they are preferred over the dry feeds. The bulk density of a diet also may have a marked effect on the feed consumption. So, talking about the variations in feeding behavior of domestic animals, feeding behavior and digestive mechanisms of domestic animals they vary widely. So, these physiological mechanisms use hormonal and neural pathways. For example, the widely varying eating habits and accompanying differences in the digestive tract are associated with correspondingly diverse physiological mechanisms to match the body needs for food with eating behavior. For instance, the pig has eating habits that are similar to those of humans. The cow and other ruminants, as well as non ruminant herbivores, have a different eating pattern. These physiological mechanisms that they use as like hormonal or neural pathways, they signal the body to use to initiate satiation. That's how we can stop a meal and to determine the meal size that depend on the presence of food in the digestive tract. As the food is ingested, it traverses the mouth. We know that then it passes the pharynx and esophagus. So this tactile stimulation signals a message to reduce the meal size. So sometimes there might be an attractive or unpleasant taste that may modulate the meal size. Like I said, the cow and other ruminants as well as non-ruminant herbivores have a different eating pattern. For example, the high cellulose forages consumed by these animals are not readily digested by their digestive tract enzymes. Instead, the cellulosic feed is digested in the rumen in non-ruminant herbivores. So actually this is the central nervous system that informs continuously by chemical signals and nerve impulses that increase the meal in that increase intensity as the meal progresses and cause the meal to end at the appropriate meal size. Thus, mechanism of this control of feed intake in non-ruminants and non-ruminant herbivores, non-ruminant carnivores and omnivores compared with ruminant and non-ruminant herbivores have some similarities. But sometimes the rate of digestive release of energy from the feed for use by the animal is slower in animals that depend on anaerobic fermentation by symbiotic microbes than it is in the other animals. There is one more factor, that's the physiological stage of animals that affect the feed consumption. So physiological stage means the point at which an animal will have satisfied its E demand that varies considerably among species of animals and according to productive function. For example, the lactation is usually associated with a marked increase in food intake. So the lactating animals have more, they need more food than the normal animals. So it's associated with a marked increase in the feed intake. So we can say that this is mainly physiological in origin. Lactating cow will have a greater demand than a pregnant cow. The absolute daily intake is of greater for high producing cows than for low producers. For example, one more physiological function is the growth. Rapid growth is associated with a greater need for feed demand. So young animals consume more feed per unit body weight than older animals. Also, there are certain animal factors that affect the feed consumption. So different species of animals, they have different level of feed intake. This might be related to body weight and metabolic size, individuality of animals, the type and level of production, and also the type and size of the gastrointestinal tract. So starting with the animal body weight. We all know that energy requirements of adult animals are related to body weight raised to some power, for example, weight to the zero point 0.7 power. Thus, an increase in body size from let's say 100 kg to 110 kg, it doesn't increase energy requirements by 10%, but by a lesser amount, for example, 7.4%. However, body weight is not itself always highly related to feed intake, particularly when we are dealing with finishing animals. For example, the beef animals, they just started on feed are apt to have a relatively little body weight. That means the body fat, for example, 10%, and may be expected to consume on the order of 2.5 to 2.7% of body weight per day. This reflects the fact that energy need, or we can say the feed consumption, is related more nearly to lean body mass than to total body weight. One more factor that affects the feed consumption is the individuality of animals. Anyone who has had experience with individually fed animals, realize that they do not all eat alike and may readily show pronounced likes and dislikes when they have the opportunity to express themselves. Or we can say the behavioral or hormonal differences may result in hyperexcitable or phlegmatic animals with the resultant effects on activity and feed consumption. Such differences make it difficult to predict how much some of these animals may consume. Third factor that affect the feed consumption is the type and level of production. As we all know that all young animals have a so-called biological urge to grow, and growth cannot be impeded greatly except by severe feed restriction or nutritional deficiency. So almost invariably, those animals showing the most rapid growth rates have the best appetites. For example, pregnancy and lactation that result in an increased appetite. With respect to lactating animals, feed intake is not correlated completely with production. Some cows, for example, have the ability to lactate at very high levels, but yet they do not increase the feed intake sufficiently to accommodate the greater milk secretion. So that results in a loss of considerable amount of body weight during peak lactation. On the other hand, we have some animals that will not deplete body reserve greatly in order to produce the milk. There are certain environmental factors also that affect the feed consumption. So regulation of body energy content is interfaced with external factors, environmental conditions, and diet composition. In most species, the feed intake is increased in cold and decreased in hot environments. So talking about the internal factors, that's the metabolic or hormonal. So these factors are actually controlled by short-term and long-term feed intake. So let me tell you in short about the short-term and long-term feed intake. What does that mean? For example, the short-term control. Hunger and satiety centers are located in the hypothalamus region, that's in the midbrain. So there has been a lot of experimental research that have been done on animals that have shown that legends in the appropriate location will cause temporary loss of appetite and lack of thirst. So this area actually appears to be responsible for initiation of feeding. So talking about the long-term controls, the animals unquestionably have some means of controlling long-term feed intake. So this is clearly demonstrated by the fact that when adequate feed of an acceptable nature is available, the wild animals do not starve or overeat. Humans and some domestic animals may be exceptions for this. So this stability of feed intake particularly true for the wild species that accumulate the amount of body fat seen in domestic animals. But there are certain intrinsic and extrinsic factors involved in the long-term appetite control that include the physiological state of the animal, such as lactation, estrus, the nitrogen and energy status of animal. Some environmental factors also affect that. For example, temperature and humidity, photo period, or seasons. So that was all about the short-term and long-term factors that affect the feed intake. We have some nutritive or feeding values, for example, feed preparation such as palleting or proper supplementation of low quality roughages that may increase the consumption. For example, the silages, they are only rarely consumed at a level approaching that of high quality hay, while the digestibility of silage may be quite good. So in general, we can say that increased concentrate consumption will result in a gradual reduction in roughages, that's the dry matter intake. It has been found that for dairy cows, the 35 to 55% concentrate in the total ration for optimum utilization of roughage and near maximum energy intake. So there is increasing caloric density of a diet that will result in a reduced intake of dry matter. We have got some high protein meals that intend to reduce the feed intake due to high meat increment resulting from the metabolism of amino acids. Some The bulk density of a diet, that's the weight per unit volume of a diet, may have a marked effect on feed intake. So volume of feed intake increased as the density increased and energy intake, that's the total digestible nutrients, decreased as density decreased. So there are some feed digestibility that also affects the feed consumption. So if the diet is diluted with undigestible, that's the animal will eat more. For example, we have some factors like the physical density of feed, particle size, amount of indigestible residues, solubility of feed dry matter, rapidity of fermentation, and level and frequency of feeding. So all these above factors may influence the rate of passage through gastrointestinal tract. Sometimes the palleting of low-quality roughages will almost always increase the consumption due to more rapid digestion and passage out of the rumen. This will in turn influence the amount of space in the gastrointestinal tract for the next meal. So talking about the inhibition of feed intake. Many compounds, we have certain compounds that inhibit the feed intake. So control of feed intake is a complex mechanism. In addition to various established and theorized mechanisms, appetite is affected generally by the factors that interfere with normal functions of the gastrointestinal tract or that affect other tissues and organs. For example, in human nutrition, there is a great interest has been shown in appetite inhibitors. That means the substances that produce anorexia that are often used in weight reduction programs. Many different compounds have been used, but most of those currently in use are amines similar to or derived from amphetamines. These compounds are stimulatory to the central nervous system, but at the same time, they result in some inhibition of appetite. So, undesirable side effects are there that occur frequently, and in addition, many people develop tolerance to the effect on appetite after a period of few weeks. So generally, these chemical inhibitors have not been proven to be very successful in many conditions. Their use is contraindicated. Talking about the feed intake for animals, that's mostly more commonly limited by caloric dilution of diets with feedstuffs of low digestibility or by restriction of the daily feed allowance. So, how can that be done? For example, feed provided in a physical form that's not preferred, such as a dusty meal, nearly always reduces the feed intake. Unpalatable ingredients can be used, such as diammonium phosphate or quinine. With ruminant species, NaCl has been used successfully to restrict the intake, but this would be hazards with the birds and pigs because they are more relatively susceptible to salt toxicity. So this salt when mixed with the protein supplements, for example, we have the cottonseed meal, can be fed for several months to cattle or sheep without detrimental results if water is not restricted. So salt may be needed in a concentration of 20 to 30% of mixture to restrict this protein supplement consumption to about 1 kg per day per cattle. There are some other factors also that affect the feed consumption. Those are the high ambient temperatures along with high humidity, reduced feed intake. Most infectious diseases sometimes result in reduced feed intake. So intestinal parasites usually result in reduced feed intake. Some metabolic diseases like ketosis, bloating, and diarrhea that also result in restricted feed intake. So all kinds of stresses that also contribute to the reduced feed intake. Sometimes the inadequate water supplies or that contaminated water result in reduced feed intake. So in this chapter, we just talked about many different factors that affect the feed consumption by animals. Ruminants and non-ruminant herbivores, for example, horses depend on symbiotic microorganisms in their digestive system to release energy from cellulose, whereas non-ruminant omnivores and carnivores depend on intestinal animals enzymes for digestion of starch and other carbohydrates. Also, we talked about that the animals that require more feed, for example, during lactation, heavy work, and rapid growth, may have greater appetites. So, let's move to our other chapter. So, the second chapter for this week is the feed preparation and processing. So, we all know that feed, forages, grains, vitamin, and mineral supplements, and so on, they represent the major cost in animal production. In ruminants, which typically consume more forage than other domestic species, feed may represent about 50%, and in non ruminants, it's about 80%. So, we may say that it's imperative to supply a nutritionally adequate diet and to prepare the diet in a manner that encourages the consumption without waste and allows high efficiency of feed utilization. We all know that feed processing is accomplished by physical, chemical, thermal, bacterial, or other alterations of a feed ingredient, so before it's fed to the animals. This feed may be modified during many steps involved between crop harvest and feeding. These processes may directly affect the feeding value as well as the ease of handling and mixing of the products treated. So it's very important to be aware of the processes to which a feed has been subjected and the effect each process has on the nutritive value of the feed. The feed processing not only enhances the feed quality, it also minimizes the loss during the feeding. Feed preparation is often more important for larger animal production operations with greater mechanization. This implies particularly to roughage because long or baled hay is less convenient to handle than the chopped, pelleted, or cubed hay. So our discussion will deal with the grain processing methods, feed processing for non-ruminants. We'll talk about the feed processing for the ruminants, feed mixing, and dry forage and roughage processing for the ruminants. Improved feed conversion or efficiency is also possible with this. It increases with these feed processing methods. Increased feed intake and faster average daily gains, some improved carcass quality or yield rate. There is some reduction in feed waste, lower transportation and storage costs, reduced labor cost due to increased mechanization. One more advantage is the reduced energy cost of processing dry versus ensiling. And we have reduced harvest costs, for example, that's the high moisture corn, improved cattle health by reduction in digestive orders. Grain processing methods, they can be divided conveniently into dry and wet processes, or we can say the cold and hot processing. We all know that heat, which is an essential part of some methods, but it's not utilized at all in others. Similarly, we have some added moisture that's essential in some methods, but maybe detrimental in others. So let's start with the cold processing methods. These are the methods that are used for cold processing include the roller mills, hammer mills, soaking, reconstitution, ensiling at high moisture content, and preservation with added chemicals. So there are several types of mill designs that are used to grind this feedstuff. The most common mills for grains are the hammer mills and roller mills. Starting with the roller mills or roller mill grinding, they act on grain by compressing it between two smooth or corrugated rollers that can be screwed together to produce smaller and smaller particles. With grains, for example, such as corn, wheat, or sorghum, the product can range in size from cracked grain to a rather fine powder. With the coarse grains like barley and oats, usually corrugated rollers are used, and the product may range in size from flattened seed to a finely ground convenient product. But the hulls will not be ground as well as with other types of grinding mills. It has been found that the advantage of roller mills is that it produces a less dusty feed than that produced by the hammer mills. So if the feed is not ground too finely, its physical texture is very acceptable to most species. So roller mill are not used with the roughages. So moving on to the hammer mills that are used for feed processing. A hammer mill processes feed with the aid of rotating metal bars, that's the hammers, that blow the ground product through a metal screen. The size of the product is controlled by changing the screen size. So these mills can grind anything from a coarse roughage to any type of grain, and the product size will vary from particles of a size similar to cracked grain to that of a fine powder. A significant amount of dust may be lost in the process, and the finished product is usually dustier than that produced with the roller mill. So here you can see the figure of a roller mill, that how it works. This is the delivery device, these are the hammers, this is the roller, and these are screens, and this is the takeaway outlet. One more method of feed processing is the soak grain method. In this method, the grain is soaked for about 12 to 24 hours in water that has long been used by livestock feeders. The soaking, sometimes with heat, softens the grain, which swells during the process, making a palatable product that should be rolled before using in finishing rations. A lot of research have been done that results. These research results do not show any marked improvement in animal performance when compared to other methods. Space requirements, problems in handling, and potential souring have discouraged the large-scale use of this method. So these are the kind of disadvantages in the soak grain method. That's why it's not acceptable further. That means the space requirement is higher, the problems in handling and potential souring that have discouraged this large-scale use of this method, soak grain method. One more method is the reconstitution. Reconstitution is similar to soaking and involves adding water to mature dry grain to raise the moisture content 25 to 30% and storage of the wet grain in an oxygen-limiting silo for about 14 to 21 days before they are fed to the animals. So this procedure actually works well with sorghum in particular, resulting in improved gain and feed conversion, compared with the results obtained with cattle fed high concentrate diets containing dry, rolled whole grain. High moisture grain method is high moisture grain is harvested at a high moisture content like 20 to 35% and stored in the silos to preserve the grain, which would spoil unless ensiled or treated with chemicals. The grain may be ground before ensiling or ground or rolled before feeding. So this is a particularly useful procedure when weather conditions do not allow normal drying in the field. So the procedure actually avoids the need to dry the grain artificially. Storage costs may be relatively high, but high moisture grain produces good feedlot results. So feed conversion particularly is improved. Ensiled wet grains are not as easily sold or transported as grains not preserved in this way. The acid preservation of high moisture grains is another method. So with higher fuel costs, increased interest has developed in eliminating the artificial drying of newly harvested cereal grains. Some data has been observed with barley or corn for pigs, and research with corn or sorghum for beef cattle show promises for the use of acids to preserve high moisture grains. So thorough mixing of 1 to 1.5% propionic acid, mixtures of acetic propionic acid or formic propionic acid into this high moisture whole corn or other cereal grains. It retard the molding or spoilage without affecting animal performance appreciably compared with that obtained with dry grains. Moving to the hot processing methods. So these methods used for heat processing grains and other products such as oilseed meals and pet food include the steam rolling, steam flaking, hopping, micronizing, roasting, palleting, and extruding. So these are the different methods that we used in this hot processing methods. So let's pressure cooking and exploding are methods that have been tried at the feedlot level. However, cost of the equipment and maintenance problems have discouraged the continued use. So starting with the steam rolling method, the steam roll grains have been used for many years because the process kills the weed seeds. Steaming is actually accomplished by passing steam up through a tower above the roller mill. The grains they are subjected to the steam for a short time, like 3 to 5 minutes prior to rolling. So most results indicate little, if any, improvement in animal performance as compared to dry rolling. But use of steam does allow production of larger particles and fewer fines. Other method is the steam flaking method. The steam flake grains are prepared in similar manner but with relatively rigid quality controls. Grain is actually subjected to high moisture steam for sufficient time to raise the water content to 18 to 20%, and this grain is then rolled to produce a rather flat flakes. So there you can see here are some of the flakes. So that's why we call it steam flake grains. Feedlot data with cattle indicate that best response is produced with thin flakes, which apparently allow more efficient rupture and exposure of starch granules and produce a more desirable physical texture. Another method of hot processing is the palleting. Palleting is accomplished by grinding the feed ingredients or feedstuffs and then forcing them through a die. So these feedstuffs usually, but not always, are steamed to some extent before palleting. So these pellets can be actually made in different shapes, diameters, lengths, and degree of hardness. We all know that all domestic animals are generally like physical nature of pellets, particularly as compared to meals, and high proportion of poultry and swine feeds are pelleted. Palleting the diet actually fines, that means it makes the diet more finely ground, frequently is desirable because the fines often will be refused otherwise. So animals that are fed pellets cannot sort and select individual components of the diet, in contrast to the case with the diets fed in meal form. Supplemental feeds such as protein concentrates are pelleted in many instances to prevent the sorting. They can be fed on the ground or in windy areas with little loss. One more method of hot processing is the popping and micronizing. So popped corn is actually produced by the action of dry heat, causing a sudden expansion that ruptures the endosperm of the seed. So this process may actually increase the rumen and intestinal starch utilization, but also results in a low density feed. Consequently, the corn usually is rolled before feeding to reduce the bulk. So what actually micronizing means is essentially the same as popping, except that the heat is provided in the form of infrared energy. So that's the difference between popping and micronizing. In case of micronizing, the heat that's provided is used in the form of infrared energy. Extruding is one more method of hot processing. Feeds or fats generally are extruded. So it has been found that the feed that has been the fats that are fed with the feeds are usually extruded. So extruded grains or grain mixtures are prepared by passing the grain or mixture through a machine with a spiral screw that forces the grain through a tapered head. So what happens in this process is that the grain is ground and heated and mixed with other ingredients, producing a ribbon-like product. Results with cattle feed diets containing extruded grain are similar to those obtained with other processing methods. So this extrusion process is actually more widely used for pet diets than for diets of food-producing animals. Spraying feeds with molasses, fat, or other liquids. So sometimes the molasses or fat is sprayed onto the surface of feeds during the mixing process. What happens because of that is it improves the palatability and reduces the dustiness of the feed. So spraying the diet with fat will also increase the energy density of the feed. It will improve the ease of mechanical handling, and it also serves as a lubricant in augers, pipes, and storage bins. Other liquids often are added to the feeds during mixing as a means of providing micronutrients, amino acids, flavor compounds, and mold inhibitors. So moving to the feed processing for non-ruminants, for example, the swine and poultry. The grinding and pelleting are the most common means of preparing feed for swine and poultry. Generally, results show that grinding to a medium to moderately fine texture results in a better performance than when grains are finely ground. Also, the feed particles of different ingredients should be a similar size so that animals do not sort out the coarse particles and leave the fines. Digestibility of grains by swine generally is improved by grinding and finely ground like 0.16 centimeter screen size grain that promotes improved efficiency compared with coarse grinding, for example 1.27 centimeter screen or larger. However, it has been found that finely ground feed is associated with an increased incidence of stomach ulcers in pigs. It has been suggested that there are certain genetic factors and stressful housing and transportation environments that affect the incidence of these ulcers. The producers, they are concerned about the high frequency of stomach ulcers associated with diets with small particle size. performance benefits of finely ground grains that clearly exists. The effect of palleting and other feed processing methods on performance of growing swine have been reviewed by different scientists. Sometimes texture of crumbles well like compared with that of pellets, particularly if the pellets are quite hard. So birds fed with the pellets exhibit more cannibalism than those given feed in mash form. The palleting generally improves the swine grain and feed efficiency to a greater extent when applied to feed grains that are low in fiber like corn, wheat, or sorghum, but the process has less effect on barley and oats. So the moving to the other animals like horses, processing of horse feed is often a matter of convenience for the feeder or for purpose of avoiding dust and mold. Generally, the efficiency is not an important consideration in contrast to the case for a fast-growing chick or a high-producing cow. Horse feeds often contain rolled or coarsely cracked grains with liberal amounts of molasses to avoid the problems with dust. Sometimes the pelleted or cubed hays are fed, but only as a small percentage of total forage fed to horses. The cubed hay has occasionally resulted in problems with choking also. In case of rabbits, they are usually fed pelleted mixed feeds or longer roughages. Commercial growers use pelleted feeds because of convenience and to reduce the waste. A substantial amount of pet food, either pelleted or processed through extruders that alter the physical form as well as the nutritive value of the feed by the heat generated in the process. The benefits of grain processing can be shown clearly in most instances when higher levels of grains are fed. But there are some research evidence that indicates the whole corn grain may be exception to this general rule when corn makes up a high percentage of the diet. So grain processing methods for sheep. Grain processing is done to improve the digestibility and efficiency of utilization. So there will be an improvement in grain feeds that are obtained by means of various processes that break up the hull or waxy seed coat and improve the digestibility of starch in the endosperm. So for a method to be more effective, it must actually reduce the wastage, increase the consumption and rate of grain, or the grain can be utilized more efficiently. Animals on a maintenance diet normally would not be fed much grain, and any improvement in efficiency normally would not return the added cost of processing. Feed processing in cows. Feed processing may result in somewhat different responses in dairy cows than for growing or finishing cattle or lambs. Generally, the feeding lactating cows high grain rations, particularly heat-treated grains or other roughage or forage in ground or pelleted form, it results in the reduced rumen acetate to proportionate ratios and lower milk fat percentages. Also, the total milk fat production may not be decreased because feedstuffs that are capable of causing low milk fat may also stimulate the increased total milk production. Most commonly lactating cows, they are fed concentrates in which the grains have been coarsely ground or steam rolled. However, it has been found that the pelleted feeds are fed in milking parlors in many operations because the cows will eat more pellets in a short period of time while being milked. Palleting also avoids some of the dust otherwise encountered in such situations. Some dairy farmers utilize the ground and ensiled high moisture grains, particularly in the corn. Grain processing for sheep includes that very few benefits can be shown for processed grain fed sheep. Diet sorting and wastage can be reduced because of palleting. Except for the advantages of palleting, sheep chew grains with the possible exception of sorghums well enough that processing is not necessary. In addition, it's not a common practice to feed as much grain to sheep as to cattle, so many possible benefits of processing are reduced. Sometimes in some feedlots, it's a common practice to pellet finishing rations, so this allows a greater use of forages or roughages, and such diets can be self-fed. So let's move to the other topic, that's the feed mixing. So after the feed is processed, the feed mixing is another method by which we can increase the feed consumption. That means the feed ingredients generally are mixed together in a commercially available mixer, or we can say in a proper ratio to provide a nutritionally balanced mixture. So there are actually two broad types of mixers. That one is the batch mixer and other is the continuous flow mixer. So let me tell you in brief about the batch mixers and the continuous flow mixers. So in case of batch mixers, there are two configurations of batch mixers, vertical and horizontal. The vertical mixers, they are cylindrically shaped with an inverted cone-shaped bottom and one or more vertical augers to move the feed from the bottom to the top of the mixer. In case of horizontal mixers, they are U-shaped with paddles or ribbon-like blades that attach to a horizontal revolving shaft. So these horizontal mixers can accommodate mixture of chopped hay, silage, grains, molasses, and other ingredients differing in the particle size, density, and texture. So they are often mounted on mobile wagons or trucks that are powered by the transport vehicle, as you can see here in this picture. The feed ingredients can be added into this mixture wagon to provide a total mixed ration. A mixture wagon can deliver and discharge the feed directly into the feeder. Another is, so this was about the batch mixers. So another is the continuous flow mixer. The continuous flow mixer rely on continuously blending all the ingredients. So feed ingredients are continuously augured and blended. So proper calibration is essential to ensure that desired composition is produced. So the system has to be calibrated that can be operated automatically without direct intervention. However, there is less flexibility in changing feed ingredients than with batch mixers, and most bulky ingredients such as hay and silage cannot be used. So continuous flow mixing systems with automated ingredient weighing and dispensing into the mix are most commonly used in large swine and poultry production units, in which the diet composition and ingredients are relatively constant. So this continuous flow mixing is actually applicable for the swine and poultry. So dry forage and roughage processing for ruminants, how we can do that. One method is the bale, dry forage and roughage. So baling is one of the most common methods of handling the dry forage and roughages, particularly where it's applicable to be sold or transported to some distances. So baling has actually a considerable advantage over loose hay staked in the field or roughage in other less dense forms. So baled hay now can be handled mechanically. It still requires considerably more hand labor than many other feedstuffs. Furthermore, considerable waste may occur in feeding depending on how it's fed. and on the level of feeding. Animals fed for high levels of production, such as dairy cows, may be quite selective so that stems will not be consumed. Thus, a high loss of nutrients occur in feeding bale hay. Also, the dehydrated bag alfalfa, though expensive, is increasingly popular for feeding horses as well as the ruminants. Moving to the chopped and ground forages and roughages, chopping or grounding puts forages and roughages into a physical form that allows the easier handling by some mechanical equipment, which tends to provide a more uniform product for consumption and usually reduces the feed refusals and waste. However, additional expenses may be incurred by grinding and loss of part of the feed, as dust may be appreciable from grinding in hammer mills. This dust is actually lost, sometimes is reduced in commercial mills by spraying the fat on the bales before they are ground. So grinding as well as palleting or cubing results in a feed with a less coarse physical texture. So this may not be an advantage with the herbivorous animals. One more method is the palleting. Palleted forages are readily consumed by the ruminants provided they are not too dense to eat readily or too soft, which results in too many fines. Forages such as long hay must be ground before palleting, so this is a slow, costly process compared to similar treatment of grains. Palleted high-quality forages and roughages, they produce the performance gain in weight in young cattle on lambs almost comparable to high grain feeding. Example of the change in density achieved with grinding and palleting, you can see that in the picture here. So this is actually achieved by baling, grinding, and then palleting. So one more method is the cubed roughages. So what actually cubing means, it's a process in which dry hay is actually forced through dryers that produce a square product about 3 centimeter in diameter of varying lengths. Grinding before cubing is not required, but usually water is sprayed on the dry hay as it is cubed. So field cubers have been developed, and stationary cubers are used to process hay from stakes or bales. It has been found that alfalfa produces the best cubes. Research data also indicate that the cubes that produce satisfactory performance in cattle, provided the cubes are not too hard. Although there are some cubes that have some disadvantage, particularly that they can be handled with mechanized feeding equipment, they have never been as popular as expected. A partial answer may be that it's difficult to detect visually because low quality hay after it has been cubed, especially if green dyes have been added. So different chemical treatments that are used for the feeding methods include the poor quality forage and other forage materials. For example, we have wood, sawdust, sugarcane, pineapple waste that's high in cellulose that represents a substantial resource for animal feed. These materials actually are not highly digestible, so considerable research is underway on this subject to improve the energy utilization of such products by the animals. So methods have ranged from soaking straws in alkali solutions for up to a month to treatments involving heat, pressure, and chemicals. So how we can improve that is the digestibility of a roughage, such as cereal straw, can be improved or can be increased a moderate amount by spraying with sodium hydroxide solution, or we can say ensiling with sodium hydroxide. Molasses, water, and so on, but costs in North America are not such that it's a feasible method at this time. So in areas where the refuge is in shorter supply, it may be a feasible method. In fact, several processing plants have been built in Northern Europe. So another method of improving the energy utilization of these fibrous seeds is by treatment with the anhydrous ammonia. So treatment with anhydrous ammonia, in this process, the nitrogen is added to the straw to enhance the activity of rumen microorganisms. Thereby that improves the breakdown and utilization of fiber that's present in the straw. So in this instance, the sheep that were fed a diet made of primarily straw plus a supplement. Untreated straw was fed as a negative control, and straw was treated by direct ammonium of the bale, which was covered, or high moisture straw was treated with a similar manner. So the ammonia or the ammoniation of poor quality roughage generally increases consumption of the roughage and digestibility of cellulose and hemicellulose. Another possible treatment is the use of alkaline hydrogen peroxide. So these are all the chemical treatments to increase the energy utilization of certain fibrous seeds. So one more is the treatment with alkaline hydrogen peroxide. So alkaline hydrogen peroxide causes some solubilization of lignin in highly lignified forages such as straw. In this case, the treatment of straw with alkaline hydrogen peroxide increased dry matter intake of the high straw diet. In addition, the treatment also increased the digestibility of dry matter and cellulose. One more method of improving the energy utilization of feeds is the addition of anhydrous ammonia or urea to low quality roughages. Generally results in increased consumption of the roughage, improvement in digestibility of dry matter, and utilization of ammonia as a nitrogen source for human microorganisms. So treatment of low quality roughages with this alkaline hydrogen peroxide, which solubilizes some of the lignin, appears to result in a marked increase in digestibility of fibrous carbohydrates in roughages that are otherwise not well utilized. So this was all we talked about today. So in brief, we talked about the numerous feed processing methods that are available that reduce the water, discourage selectivity of ingredient consumption, and usually increase the feed consumption and efficiency of feed utilization. Certain feed processing that's of particular importance for animal consuming feed at high levels and for animal expected to form at high levels of production. We have some newer methods of chemically treating low quality forages. That's we talked about the anhydrous ammonia, we talked about the alkaline hydrogen peroxide, the treatment with NaOH solutions, etc. So that was all about the different feed processing and feed preparation methods that we talked about today. Thank you.